Good luck, everybody. As you hear me say week after week, to start off your week by listening to stories of tzaddikim, of the Rebbeim, brings bracha in every aspect of our lives. And with the pandemic going so global, it's time to make Torah, it's time to make good things go viral. So once again, I want to thank Rabbi Kolobach for making the time every week and so professionally and excitingly sharing with us stories of the Rebbeim. Rabbi Kolobach is covering the life of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was born in 1880 in Czarist Russia and passed away in New York on the Shvat, the 10th of Shvat, 1950. Rabbi Kolobach, thank you for making the time. Over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Masinta, and let us hope that the great prayers of all these stories and inspiration of our Rebbeim should help us with bracha and the ultimate bracha of bringing Mashiach. Tonight, I would like to start a little differently before we carry on with the biography of the Frierdiker Rebbe. We got up to when he became Rebbe in 1920. But I'd like to start with a little story of the previous Rebbe that ties up with a portion of the week. And this story was told by Rabbi Yossel Weinberg. That's Rabbi Levi Weinberg's father, Rabbi David Weinberg's grandfather. And when the previous Rebbe was in America already, there were many people living in America whose ancestors, or even they themselves, had come from Lubavitcher Hasidim. And between 1880 and 1920, the mass immigration, they moved to America. And many of them had stopped being from, even though they still had a very strong connection possibly with Lubavitch. There are many shuls throughout America, which are in Canada, which are called Nusach Harid, that's a Tzedek shul, etc., because of where they came from. So the Rebbe sent two of his emissaries in 1942 to visit Chicago, and he asked them to make an appointment with a certain banker who, as I say, his roots were from Lubavitcher Hasidim. They spoke to the local rabbi, who agreed that he'll make the appointment. The banker agreed to the appointment, and the three rabbis came, and they began discussing with the banker all aspects of Judaism. The meeting went well. Sadly, I hate to say bad things, but in those days, it seems like a banker of his caliber, the only time he came into contact with rabbis was when they needed some money from him. Can you believe it? Anyway, so towards the end of their meeting, the banker was suitably impressed. He takes out the checkbook and he says, "Who do I make the check out to?" So these two shluchim said, "We are not here for a check." And that got his attention. Until then, he had believed everything they were saying was just in order to get the check. But now they had his attention. They said, "They're not even here for a check at all." So he said, "If you're not here for a check, what are you here for?" For a moment, they were dumbfounded until one of the shluchim, one of the emissaries of the Rebbe, of the previous Rebbe, said, "Do you know, a Sefer Torah has to be letter perfect. In Eastern Europe, there were many communities who were too poor to afford their own scribe to check their Torahs. So there used to be traveling scribes. And these traveling scribes would go from place to place, shtetl to shtetl, and they would check to make sure that the Torah was perfect. And that's how they made their living. And he concluded, you know that every Jew is actually a Torah. But it can happen that a letter, a mitzvah fades, possibly the mitzvah of tefillin fades, the mitzvah of Shabbos fades, of kosher, and it is our job to go around from Jew to Jew and to rectify their Sefer Torah. And that's what we are doing here. We're trying to get you to rectify your Sefer Torah, to make it kosher by resolving to take on certain mitzvahs. The banker was very appreciative of the whole analogy, and he accepted it, and he sent them on their way. When they came back to the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, they gave a report of everything they had done. And the Rebbe smiled, and he said, your words are good, your analogy is good, but it's not perfect. Yes, a Jew is a Sefer Torah, but not a Sefer Torah where there is ink written on top of the parchment, that it's two separate entities that are put together. Rather, a Jew is a Sefer Torah which is engraved into the stone. The letters are etched into the stone. They're part and parcel of the intrinsic thing. The only thing is, within time, sand, grime, pebbles can get onto those engravings and you can't read it. All you have to do is blow away the grime, and then you see it. And this, my friends, is how the Rebbe explains the whole, one of the aspects in this week's portion, Toldos, which describes at great length how Yitzchak dug wells and they fought over the wells. And the question is, why does the Torah tell us so much about Yitzchak's wells? Torah's timeless. What's it all about? And the Rebbe says, what is a well? A well is something, like a borehole. The water's underneath. It doesn't have to be brought there, but you can't see the well. And what the job is to uncover it. And the Rebbe also taught us that, I think it was George Rohr, someone who had come to the Rebbe before on a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, just around that time, he had an audience. It's on the video, and he said that there are many Jews who come to his shul who don't know anything about the siddur or davening. They just sit there like glumps. So he made a minyan for beginners to explain to them what the machzor is all about, what the davening is all about. And when he came to the Rebbe, he said to the Rebbe, Rebbe, you'll be proud to know that in our shul for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, I organized a minyan for Jews with no background. And the Rebbe said, that was what he used to do, and he didn't like what you were saying. And he repeated it. After a couple of times, the Rebbe said, what do you mean a Jew with no background? There is no such thing. Every Jew has the same background. We are all children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is the wells that Yitzchak built. And the Rebbe, there are many organizations that deal with bringing Jews towards Torah and mitzvahs. In Chabad Chassidus, we call it Hafotzas Hamayonos, which means spreading the wells, because we are uncovering the well. Certain other organizations have the expression Kiruv Rachokim, to bring close those who are distant. The Rebbe did not approve of that description. He said there is no such thing as a Jew who is rachok, who is far, that we have to bring him close. It's just within that we have to uncover. So today I started with the story, which I usually end with. Now we get back to the previous Rebbe. Last week, we concluded how the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, had taken ill. He was only 60 years old, and he passed away, as we described, on the 2nd of Nisan in Rostov-on-Don in 1920. His house and everything is still there, including his grave site where he is. And there's a Chabad that the Chabad owns the previous courtyard that the Rebbe Rashab was in. When the previous Rebbe became Rebbe, he was following the will of his father, and he began saying Chassidus, and the will had asked that everyone accept his only son, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok, as their Rebbe. The Rebbe himself, the previous Rebbe, in 1921, got very, very ill. His life was actually in danger until, Baruch Hashem, he recovered. That time in Russia was terrible, terrible turmoil. We all know, first of all, there was the First World War. They overthrew the Tsar. Then there were wars, civil wars between the whites and the reds, and the communists took over. The communists were people who did not believe in religion. They called religion the opium of the masses, and they came out against all religions. However, the communist regime itself, the GPO, which was the forerunner of the NKVD and the KGB, they themselves weren't as intent on tearing Judaism out of Russia as, sadly to say, a group of Jews themselves who called themselves the Yevsektia. The Yevsektia means the Jewish section in Russian. And these were Jews, parents were from even, who took on the communist socialism, and with a passion and with a terrible, violent hatred towards all religion, they worked more than anyone else to tear Judaism, to tear Torah and mitzvahs out of the Jews and Russia. And it is in a way because of them that the hatred towards Torah and mitzvahs was stronger than it was against any other religions. And the Rebbe had to work very, very hard. At that time, Judaism, the Torah, mitzvahs, the Yevsektia were tearing it out, even though by law, by Russian law, it was only forbidden to have public teachings, but you could still keep the shuls open. You could still keep mikvahs open. A parent was allowed to teach their children Torah. And that is what the previous Rebbe continued to insist. When they tried to close a mikveh, he would open it, and he had many sacrifices towards Yiddishkeit. They did interrogate him in Rostov before 1924, when he was forced to leave. And in the interrogation, there were actually a couple of Jews and a non-Jew. And the Rebbe said to them about one of the aspects that this guy is Jewish. So the guy said, "How do you know I'm Jewish?" And the Rebbe answered that his grandfather, the Rebbe Marash, would recognize a Jew when he walked on the street. Once he was in Kiev, and he met one of these young guys who had become anti-religious, and his grandfather asked him in Yiddish, where is a certain renowned professor who was in Kiev at that time. That youngster who was trying to hide his Judaism became extremely upset. And he said, "How do you know that I am Jewish?" And the Rebbe Marash said that at the time of your bris, the mohel stuck this sign on your nose. And that's how I know that you're Jewish. So the previous Rebbe said to them, "I don't know that sign, but I do recognize another Jew." In 1922, the previous Rebbe set up 9 other Hasidim, 10 Hasidim in total, and they made a committee of 10 that they will go on self-sacrifice until their last drop of blood, if that's what it takes, to spread Judaism. And the Rebbe often spoke publicly against all the Evsektia and those who are trying to erode Judaism, and he was actually putting himself in danger. And someone came over to him and he said, "You know, where do we find in Torah that it is correct to go so much on self-sacrifice for what you're doing?" And he answered that all the work in the Beis Hamikdash was done by Kohanim and Leviim, except for sacrificing the animal that was allowed by an Israelite, by a Yisrael. And there was one other thing which was also done by a non-Kohen, and that was taking the goat to the Azazel on Yom Kippur. You know, they made a lottery. There was 2 goats. One went to Shecht, and the other one went to what they call La Azazel. And that goat was taken outside Jerusalem and thrown down some mountains and basically died as a result of it. And it was a sign of atonement for the Jewish people. But the Talmud tells us that the one who sent that goat to the Azazel would not live out his life. He would pass away that year. So, but this was an important service in the Beis Hamikdash. Says the Rebbe to him, so you see, even though the person knew that by taking on this service, he's going to pass away that year, nevertheless, there were so many volunteers because they knew this is what God wants. And therefore, the Torah wants us to find life, but nevertheless, we should be ready to sacrifice everything we have to in order to spread Judaism. And the financial situation was extremely difficult, and many from Jews lost their way of making a living. The previous Rebbe was extremely involved in raising funds to help people, including to build mikvahs in every little shtetl. The schools were closed down. He would hire teachers to teach. They had to be able to support their family. The Rebbe would help support them. Many times he would take loans, personal loans, and support the teachers and the rabbis. The Rebbe says about that time that as much self-sacrifice as the previous Rebbe had, there was one thing that hurt him more than anything else. And that was that a chassid of his who went out on Mesiras Nefesh to teach children, to be the Rav, to establish mikvahs, etc. At that time, he knew that there was a danger that the Avsektia might catch onto them and send those teachers. There were different types of punishment. The worst was a firing squad, killed on the spot. And then there was sending people to Siberia, sending them to the gulags, sending them to forced labor or just to exile. We know the Rebbe's father passed away in that way because of his spread of Judaism. And the previous Rebbe knew, as did the people that he was sending, that it could be, there is a possibility that he's sending them to his death. And you can be sure, said the Rebbe, nothing hurt the Rebbe more than putting his Hasidim in this dangerous position. And yet, Torah and mitzvahs and continuing Judaism in communist Russia was so important to the Rebbe that not only was he ready to put his whole personal life on the line, he was ready to put all his Hasidim's life in the same way. And even after a Chassid was caught and sent to his death to Siberia, it still didn't prevent the Rebbe from calling another Chassid and telling him, so-and-so was just caught for being there, but I'd like you to go, and that Chassid would go. This was the Mesiras Nefesh of the Jews in Russia in the previous Rebbe's times, something we cannot relate to or truly understand what that is all about. And he also got a lot of financial help from the Joint. There was a Dr. Yosef Rosen who used to help him. In 1924, he was forced to leave Rostov because of his activities, and he had to move to Leningrad. In Leningrad, they knew exactly where he is. And the previous Rebbe tells stories of how sometimes his life was saved. He used to travel first class on the train. He writes many, many stories about his encounters with people on the train. And one thing he always made sure was to tip the concierge, the doorman in every hotel very well. And that, in fact, at times saved his life, because the Avsektia were searching for him, and they used to go. There were many, many Jews, sadly, who became informers. And there are many reasons for it, as we'll discuss shortly. And they just felt that everyone would work with them. And they came to the hotel and asked, is Schneerson there? And the concierge, or whatever you call him there, the receptionist said, no, he isn't at the moment. And he called up the previous Rebbe in his room, and he said, they are looking for you. I will tell you a separate entrance to the exit to leave the hotel and go to another one. And he basically made a sacrifice to sneak the Rebbe out of that hotel and to get him to another one. And so the years passed by, and we get to the most difficult year of all, which was 1927. Rebbe Yechaim Althuis writes that in 1927, On Rosh Hashanah, when the previous Rebbe blew the shofar, he trembled, and they could tell from his conduct at Rosh Hashanah that that will be a very, very difficult year indeed. Now, the way the previous Rebbe writes in his writings, he kept a diary, a detailed diary of everything that happened to him, and some of those diaries have been revealed to us. It seems like at the beginning, the Evsektia and the GPU were not coordinating together. And the GPU looked at the Evsektia with derision, although later they climbed in the ranks. And there are times when in front of the previous Rebbe, he saw this dissension. Now, at that time, they were trying to make, there were certain, what you could call Reform Jews who were not necessarily communists, but they were trying to create changes in Judaism, similar to the Enlightenment in the Tzemach Tzedek's time. And they wanted to call a conference together of all the rabbis in Russia, and they would bring in certain changes into the education and the frumkeit of Yidden. They had very smooth tongues, and they basically lied about their plans. And they got the chief rabbi of Leningrad, the Rabbi Katzenellenbogen, to agree to their plans. And the Evsektia were very, very interested that this should go ahead, because then they can bring their changes into Yiddishkeit. And many rabbis were for it. The previous Rebbe, they came to visit the previous Rebbe, and he sensed that there was something wrong. Here are people who themselves don't keep kosher Shabbos by their own admission, and they're so concerned for the benefit of Yiddishkeit, and he realized that it is not to the benefit, and he came out openly opposing this whole conference, which angered the Evsektia immensely. Now, they put out lies. They said that they had been to the previous Rebbe and he had agreed with him. The previous Rebbe sent people to that chief rabbi of Leningrad to try and get him to oppose, but he was, this chief rabbi was told that it's a case of Misnagdim versus Hasidim, and he wanted the meeting to go ahead until the previous Rebbe had to come out publicly. And he said, although he didn't want to, he knew he was putting his life in danger. He came out publicly against the whole conference, and he said that this is not Beruach HaTorah, this is not in the benefit of from people, it's just going to create tremendous, tremendous harm. And being that he came out so publicly against it, he knew he was putting himself into risk. They abolished it. That put him of 1927. The Rebbe went all out. There were many, many spies that used to come to his Farbrengens. Now, these spies, you couldn't tell they were spies because some of them looked like any other Jews. You have to appreciate that in that time, the Evsektia was the Jewish section. Many of them were former Lubavitch Hasidim, or their parents were Lubavitch Hasidim, and they came out against the whole religion with a violent hatred. Thank God you don't meet such Jews today. Today, Jews are ignorant, but they don't hate the Yiddishkeit with such a passion as these guys did. And the Rebbe openly told his Hasidim, if these guys from the Avsektia build a fire and they say, we give you a choice, either send your children to our schools, take them out of yeshivas and send them to our schools, or let yourself be thrown into the fire. He says, I say publicly, rather let yourself be thrown into the fire than give in to those threats. And the Avsektia saw that there was one man leading hundreds and thousands of shtetlach in Russia and the Hasidim, and he himself was standing up against the whole Avsektia who wanted to abolish Judaism. And they came to the conclusion that the only way they will be successful is if they get Rahman al-Itzlan, we should never know about it, if they get rid of the previous Rebbe. And by hook or by crook, they finally got permission from the government to arrest the previous Rebbe. And the previous Rebbe describes in great, great detail of how the arrest took place. It was in the 15th of Sivan in 1927. The charge concocted was that there were illegal counter-revolutionary activities. And they actually arrested his main secretary, which was Rebbe Elchanan Dov Morozov. He was never heard from again. And they had many of letters because there was a detailed list of every shtetl, of every school, etc., where it should, the money was to go. And they came to arrest him. He says that it was a Yechidus night on the 15th of Sivan. It was a few minutes after midnight. He was very fatigued. He was just about to get ready to eat meal with his family. And two people jumped in and rushed into the dining room. And they said, we were sent by the administration. Who is Schneerson? Where is he? He said, the Rebbe answered very, very coolly, clearly. He said, I don't know who you're looking for, but I'm sure that when you come to a person's house, you know where you are coming and you don't have to shout. He said he's not shouting. And they made a search of the Rebbe's rooms. His family were all with there. And the two people who had come in to arrest him, one was called Nachmanson, a Jewish boy from Nevel. His father used to visit Lubavitch. And there was another one was called Lulav. And he was from Riga. And there's a long story about the discussion between his daughters and the previous Rebbe. The previous Rebbe said to Nachmanson that he agrees to go quietly with them after they had spent an hour and a half ransacking every room. And they said, I want to take my tefillin with me. And Nachmanson said, I promise you, you can take your tefillin with you, and you'll be able to put them on, etc. I'm skipping quite a bit here because I want to get to the end of the whole story. As they were leaving, he describes what he put into the suitcase. He had 3 pairs of tefillin, his talis, certain things of clothing, and some money and some food. And this was all in one case. As they were leaving, the previous Rebbe had given the case to one of the non-Jewish guards to carry for him. And Lulav grabs the case out of the non-Jewish guard's hand, and he says to the previous Rebbe, you know, my grandfather was a chassid of your grandfather, and they used to travel sometimes together. And when my grandfather traveled with your grandfather, he would carry his case. So now I also want, so to say, the honor of carrying your case. And the previous Rebbe looked at him.
Alex, Alex, your sound seems off. I don't know if your sound seems off. Just let me check with other people. Hold on.
Oi. What's going on? Is it on?
Yeah, it's back on.
Oi, sorry.
It was when Lulav offered to take his case.
Sorry. So Lulav it said my grandfather went where your grandfather, previous Rebbe said your grandfather went in the direction that my grandfather wanted to, he could carry his case. You want me to go in your direction, it'll never happen. He took his case and he gave it to the guy to take with him. There is a very long description, and if you want, you could read it in English, in Siches in English, about the previous Rebbe writing about his whole arrest and everything that happened to him. It is not only mind-blowing, but it is frightening just reading the words. He says that the name Spalerka prison was enough to put terror into any person's hearts who lived there. And that's where they were taking him. In the Spalerka prison, there's a whole story how he got in. And the minute he got in to the prison, Nachmanson said, I promised you to put on a tefillin, but that was in your house. Here, there is no way we are going to allow it. And basically, they took away his case. And he was determined to not allow, number one, any fear to get him down, no matter what they tried to do to him, and not to show any fear. And he says one of their main ways that they got control over people was by the fear. Anyway, when he got in, they told him to go down a certain corridor towards the open door. He says he was walking down that corridor, and either intentionally or unintentionally, when he got towards the end where they had told him to go into that open door, the corridor itself was frightening. It was dark with just the walls were all gray and just inhibiting looking, but there was a little door. There was a door open, branching off the right, and there the walls were whitewashed. And as he says, he's not sure how, but by mistake, he walked through that whitewash, that other door, rather than going into the corridor that they had told him. When he realized that he had done it, His first thought was, maybe I'll get into trouble. I should go back to the door they told me to. But then he remembered, he says, the Baal Shem Tov taught that everything that happens is b'hashgacha pratis, is by divine providence, and that we are in God's care. And he decided to just remain there. And he sat down and he had a cigarette, and some people came out, asked him what you are doing here. And it turned out that had he gone into the corridor that he was told, there, Rahman al-Islam, there was a good possibility nothing would have happened. They would have just killed him on the spot. But as a result of this guy coming out, he brought them in. He brought him into a room, an interrogation room, where there was a big room with 20, 40 secretaries, each one interviewing the prisoner in front of them. And she gave him a questionnaire and said, you have to fill out the questionnaire. He said, I don't have to fill out anything. You want, you can fill it out based on what I said. The unbelievable courage that the previous Rebbe showed there. And basically, he broke all their rules. And he kept asking for his case back. By some miracle, they brought his case back to him, and he had his tefillin in his hand. Going to the cell, he says from then he was not given a number. And once they were given a number, you're not called by your name anymore. He makes a whole explanation about it. He was informed that he will not be able to daven or put on his tefillin. He was being taken up a long flight of steps, and he realized that before they put him into the cell, they're going to take it away from him. So he quickly put on the hand tefillin, and he was putting on the head tefillin when the person accompanying him was in front of him on that tall flight of stairs, and he turned around and he saw him in tefillin. He grew furious. He said, what are you, crazy? You're trying to make this jail into a shul? And he pushed him, kicked him down, and he fell down those whole flight of stairs. And the previous Rebbe writes that he was wearing a belt with a very beautiful, good buckle, it seems. And somehow that buckle got untied, and the metal of the buckle caused a wound in his stomach and opened it up. It was bleeding, and he was very weak. They wanted to put him into a solitary cell, but there were no solitary cells. So they put him into another cell with 3 other people who showed him actually tremendous respect. And again, the previous Rebbe describes the whole thing. I want to get to some of the interrogations. The interrogations were made in the middle of the night, and they were there mainly not only to because they had made up their minds, but they were there to intimidate people. He says when he came into the interrogation room, there was this Nachmanson and Lulav amongst others, and they had these strong spotlights shining on the prisoner. And he wanted to show them that he was not afraid. So as he came in to the interrogation room, he remarked, he said, I would like to tell you, at first he said, do you know, this is the first time that I walk into a room and no one stands up for me. So Nachmanson got angry. He said, were you crazy? Do you know where you are now? He says, yes, I'm in a room that doesn't need a mezuzah. And the only rooms that don't need a mezuzah is a toilet or a stable. And then he said, before you interrogate me, I'd like to tell you a story. They said, you're not here for stories. You don't understand what your situation is and where you are. And the Rebbe said, everybody likes stories, so I'm going to tell it to you anyway. In the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, my grandfather, he once had a debate with a real atheist. So one of those Jewish interrogators jumps up and he says, do you mean like me? I'm also an apikoides, an atheist. And the Rebbe answered to him, no, you are not an atheist. You're an ignoramus. He says, you don't become an atheist by hacking chemichkes. Hacking chemichkes was something that the bums used to do outside the taverns and the bars. They would put sunflowers seeds into their mouth and blow out the shells. So he said, you are not an atheist, you're an ignoramus. An atheist means someone who is sophisticated, learned, and philosophical, and has come to the conclusion after learning everything that he doesn't believe in God. Any schmo who just doesn't know anything and says that he doesn't believe in God, no matter how anti he is, he said is not an atheist, he's an ignoramus. So he says that my grandfather was having a debate and he saw that he couldn't get through to this atheist. And so he told him, right now you refuse to believe in God. I predict that one day you'll get a kadachas, that's a certain very terrible stomach ailment, and then you'll come to believe in God. And he said, I'm telling you the same. Right now, you think you're in the pound seat, sitting there as interrogators, doing the job of the Russian government. I'm telling you, one day they're going to turn on you and they'll send you guys to Siberia or wherever, and that's when you will turn to God as well. And by the way, that happened. All those people of the Yevsektia, when Stalin came in, he turned on all of them and he sent them all to Siberia. They had very terrible deaths. They accused him of all kinds of counter-revolutionary acts. And he said that what he is doing is not against the communist laws, and he refused to answer many of their questions or comply with them. One of the interrogators picked up a gun, pointed it at the Rebbe, and he said, this little toy made many people change their minds. To which the previous Rebbe answered, that toy can only make people who have many gods, meaning many desires in life, and one world, it could make them change their mind. I, who have one God in two worlds, it does nothing to me. And he stood up against them in the most amazing ways. He writes the whole order of jail, how it went when they brought food, and how they gave him a right to send telegrams. When he was arrested, he wrote 3 telegrams, one to the head of the Holzpalerka prison, another to the head of the Russian government, and another to Nachmanson, demanding his tefillin. And until they brought him tefillin, he said, he will not eat any food or drink. And he said the other prisoners in this cell would be able to testify. He actually went on a hunger strike for over 2 days until finally they relented and brought him back his tefillin. The Rebbe points out how miraculous the whole story of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe's arrest and, more important, his liberation is. If anybody doubts the existence of God Almighty in any way, if anyone wants proof that God is here and he runs the world and oversees everything, he says, all you have to do is look at the story of the previous Rebbe. He compares it to the whole story of Purim. Here is one man who stood up against the entire force of the communist regime. He was the one man, the whole Jewish life in Russia, from that time all the way to the downfall of communism, was all based on this one man's activities. They were determined to get rid of him. Think to yourself, how many millions of people did these communists and Yevsektsias kill and destroy? They had one Jewish leader in their hands. How difficult would it have been to just, Rahman al-Islam, as they wanted to do, take him out to the firing squad? And yet they never did. And this was a miracle, an open miracle of Hashem. They actually did give him the death sentence. And in fact, they found now the whole portfolios of the interrogators, and the Rebbe wrote this up. In the meanwhile, the Hasidim who were in Russia, including, by the way, not only the Rebbe's family, but also our Rebbe was already engaged to the previous Rebbe's second daughter. The marriage wouldn't take place till 1928. Kislev were coming up to the anniversary. Now it's in 9 days, his anniversary in 1928. But it took time because of all this turmoil till they got married. And he was coming to the house of the Rebbe when the arrest took place, and his Kala, the Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's second daughter, looked at the window and saw her chosin coming. She said, "We have guests." And the Rebbe understood immediately, and he went to the Rebbe's secretary, Reb Chaim Lieberman, and others, and they got rid of many incriminating papers. And the word got out overseas that the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was incarcerated and his life was in danger. And Hasidim throughout the world started to put pressure on the Russian government to get him out. It's interesting to note that in Germany, the previous Rebbe had gone to visit there many times. He had tremendous respect from everybody, and both the Orthodox and the Reformed rabbis were putting pressure on the Russian government to free the Rebbe. And because of this pressure, and I'd like to point out that the communist regime in 1927 was going through a very difficult time. There was no food to be had in Russia, basically. There was famines, and they were dependent on deals with other governments to feed their people. There was also a lady, Pashkava. She was the head of the Red Cross, and she got extremely involved with putting pressure onto the government to let him out. So they first gave him the death sentence. The government overrode the Evsektia, and they changed it to 10 years in exile in Siberia. This leader of the Red Cross didn't stop, and she continued to put pressure. And they changed that to 3 years exile in Kostroma. The Rebbe tells a story that when he was told that he would have to go to Kostroma, he was allowed to visit his family first. And again, I cannot overemphasize the miracles in him getting out. But they said he'd have to go to Kostroma. It was quite a long train ride. And the train ride involved breaking Shabbos. And even though it was to his advantage, and they knew how much the Evsektia were against him if he stayed in Leningrad at that time, he refused to go, travel on Shabbos. They said, if you don't go, you're going to have to go back to prison, which he preferred rather than traveling. And the Rebbe said he was putting his whole life back into danger. But he knew how everyone was watching him and how the effect it would also have on other Jews. And he refused to go travel on Shabbos. So after Shabbos, he went. When he came to this train station, he was arrested for spreading Judaism. He gave a statement to the thousands of Jews who had come to see him off. And he said, he quoted his father that said that ever since God took us out of Egypt, the Goyim could never, ever enslave us again. They could put our bodies into prison. They could put our bodies under torture, but never our souls. Our souls remain free. And he gave tremendous strength to all. While he was in Kostroma, this was the 3rd of Tammuz, that it was changed. The Rebbe said that in itself was the greater miracle, but they didn't rest. The pressure continued on the government until on the 12th of Tammuz, which was his birthday, they agreed to free him. It was a public holiday, so they only actually freed him on the 13th of Tammuz, and those 2 days are celebrated. The previous Rebbe wrote a letter in which he said, it is not only me that has been redeemed, but the entire Jewish people. And wherever he went afterwards, when he went to Israel, when he went to America, everybody recognized the previous Rebbe as the Baal Mesiras Nefesh, the person who gave up everything, his life, his torture, just for Judaism and to make sure that he spread it. And he was given worldwide acclaim for it, as we'll discuss in later time. It was very, very dangerous for him to remain in Leningrad because the Evsektia did not agree to him being freed. They knew his power, and he was the one person standing up against them. As I say, if there was Judaism left in the 70s under communist regime, it was all from the previous Rebbe. So he had to get out of there. And then the Hasidim realized that he had to get out of Russia. Now, England stopped working with Russia. They wanted nothing to do with them. Russia, as I say, needed wheat and food, and it tried to make deals with Latvia. One of the parliamentary ministers was a Rabbi Mordechai Dubin. There were people in Germany who gave the previous Rebbe letters that they want him as a rabbi, and Reb Motzei Shabbos wrote that he wanted the Rebbe as the rabbi in Riga in Latvia. And he put tremendous pressure on his government, and they made it conditional that if Russia wants Latvia to sign any treaties of supplying Russia with food, the condition is that they have to let the previous Rebbe go. After tremendous pressure, the Russian government was ready to agree to it, but on condition that the previous Rebbe doesn't, from Latvia, do all kinds of activities against the Russian government, and they're going against Yiddishkeit. So the condition was that his family stay behind in Russia as a bargaining tool. That's what they did. The previous Rebbe refused to go. And with the pressure from the Latvian government, the previous Rebbe made the following conditions: that he, his family, and his library be allowed to go. As we're running out of time, they allowed him and his family to go, together with his immediate family and 6 people. Included in that family was our Rebbe. He was engaged to the second daughter, as I mentioned. So they said, "Who is this?" He said, "This is my son-in-law, my future son-in-law." They said, "A future son-in-law? That's not immediate family. You could get another son-in-law elsewhere." And he said, "A son-in-law like this, you cannot get anywhere." Now, in order to allow his library to go, they had to send certain officials to stamp it. Amongst the officials were Jews, and they recognized the value of the Rebbe's library. In it were many manuscripts from the previous Rebbes. It was a veritable treasure of wealth, that library. And they said, "We can't let this go. This is priceless." And the previous Rebbe kept saying, if they don't let that go, he isn't going. The Russian government seemed so desperate to get him out, that they sent out other people who weren't Jewish to look at the library, and they stamped it, and the Rebbe was free to go to Riga. Now, in the 1920s, while the previous Rebbe was Rebbe, there were Hasidim of his who had gone out to Poland, and he set up yeshivas in Warsaw. He set up a yeshiva in Hebron, as I mentioned, and in different places in Europe. And thousands of Hasidim came to see the previous Rebbe off, and he assured them, don't give up. Don't stop your Yiddishkeit. And he promised many of them, don't worry, we will see each other again. This was in 1927, where he went to Riga with Reb Motzei Shabbos. Unfortunately, Reb Motzei Shabbos was killed by the Nazis, but he had a tremendous hand in saving the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. So we got up to how the previous Rebbe ended up having to leave Russia. He went to as I say, to Riga, to Latvia. He also went many times to different places to recuperate. He never regained his health totally after that. And we still will talk about, God willing, the Rebbe's wedding, and then the In 1929, the previous Rebbe announced, because many times he went to the graves of his four ancestors in Lubavitch, the Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Marash. He went to the Rebbe Rashab, obviously, and he said, because I cannot pray at the graves of my ancestors, and we don't appreciate, I don't think fully what that means, especially when you look at how many times the Rebbe went to the Ohel. So he said, as a result, he is going to visit the Mekomis HaKadoshim, the holy places in Israel. And he made a trip to Israel. So I hope next week we will start with the trip to Israel and certain things that happened to him on the ship. From Israel, he would travel to America in 1929, where he was received with great honor and acclaim. We'll go through the years of 1930 to 1939, where he was in Warsaw during the bombing that the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, had over Warsaw, what he saw there, how he was saved, in fact, by German officers of the Wehrmacht, and he made it to America, and then the last years of his life. I hope you are enjoying this series and gaining much more knowledge of it. Let us take the previous Rebbe's life as an inspiration. And he often said, sacrifice, Mesiras Nefesh, for Yiddishkeit does not mean giving up your life or being tortured. It means giving up a wish and a desire. And when we show God how we're ready to give up our own personal desires for Torah and mitzvahs, we pray that Hashem will agree to our ardent, most fervent desire of sending Moshiach now. A good vach. We'll see you next week.
Good luck. Thank you, Rabbi Kalabach. Always really enjoyable.
Aaron, you'll put it on Facebook this year.
We will.
This
It will be
week.
on Facebook and it will be on YouTube.
Okay.
And the whole thing as well.
Good vach. All the
Good
best.
luck to all who joined. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great evening.